Thank you for downloading this episode of a History of Central Florida podcast. This is the podcast where we explore Central Florida's history through the artifacts found in local area museums and historical societies. This is the series brought to you by Riches, the regional initiative to collect the histories, experiences, and stories of Central Florida and the Orange County Regional History Center. I am Kevin Stapleton, and I will be your host for today's episode titled The Art Colony Bell. The bell is set in a Spanish-styled arch on the grounds of what is now the Maitland Art Center. The property and the bell was initially used by the Research Studio, or the Colony as it was commonly known. It was an artist's commune designed and built by Andre Smith in the late 1930s. The bell was used to summon the eclectic group of artists who were selected by Andre Smith to live and work in the center during the winter months. The Colony was a project begun by Smith, but supported by local philanthropists. Mary Curtis Bach, the founder of Ladies' Home Journal, who along with her husband created the Bach Tower Gardens in Lake Wales, Florida, was an early supporter of Smith and the Colony. Another early supporter was Annie Russell, the famous stage actress who had made Winter Park her home by this time and helped build the Rollins College Theater named in her honor. Smith, Bach, and Russell are all immortalized on the bell. Bethany Gray, from the Maitland Art Center, explains the origins of the bell and how these three people became associated with the bell.
Mary Curtis Bach, who we generally know associated with the Bach Tower Gardens, was the woman who funded Andre Smith in creating his vision here at the Maitland Art Center, which is originally called the Research Studio. There are several bells, obviously, at the Bach Tower Gardens, so Mary had her own connection. This bell was made in England for her to her specifications and was installed for the opening ceremonies here at the Research Studio on the 1st of January in 1937. There are three sets of initials on the bell: Mary Bach, Annie Russell, and Andre Smith. And the initials are in Andre Smith's handwriting. Mary had them cast into the bell with Andre's designs.
The bell was designed by Andre Smith, financed by Mary Curtis Bach, and cast by John Taylor and Company of Loughborough, England in 1937. Bethany Gray discusses the purpose of the bell.
Well, originally, the bell was to be rung for calling the artist to common meals or anytime there was going to be a meeting in the courtyard. Andre was an extremely private person. He didn't spend a lot of one-on-one time with the Bach Fellows, but he did occasionally want to collect them all together, and the bell was a signal for people to gather in the courtyard.
These communal gatherings would include Smith as well as Achilio Duke Banca, a friend of Smith and a caretaker at the Colony. Richard Colvin from the Lake Eustis Museum of Art describes the scene surrounding these frequent events and who might be involved in these regular rituals.
And the story always went is that he instituted a tradition of having afternoon tea several times a week, and he would ask Duke Banca to ring the bell at 4 p.m. when he wanted the artist to gather. The base of the bell, just outside that little loggia, is a rectangle of pavers, and that's where he would have Duke set up a table, maybe leave a table set up, and he would meet the artist to discuss their ongoing projects and I guess anything else that might come up. A lot of what we knew about that particular tradition not only came down through the Banca family, but also a particular photograph which they have there, which shows Smith, Duke Banca, sitting there with several of the Bach Fellows.
The Research Studio was a unique artistic and cultural center during the 1930s. Richard Colvin tells us that while Andre was an artist in his own right, the Research Studio was probably his greatest work.
Well, Andre Smith was a visionary artist, architect. He's also fairly well known as an advocate and an activist and as an artist during World War I, which was basically his earliest fame. But his greatest accomplishment, probably in addition to his own personal artwork, which was exquisite, but his greatest accomplishment was probably the creation and subsequent administration of the research studio that he built, opening in January of 1938, and where he lived each winter until his death in 1959.
Smith was dedicated to his artistic experiment. Bethany Gray talks about how he selected some of the artists who attended the center.
He is looking for the most progressive, sort of avant-garde characters that he can find to bring here for his winter-long fellowships. He has plenty of connections in New York City, galleries up there, and he's taking recommendations from them, as well as from artists that he knows, to be able to sort of single out the individual types that he's looking for.
We do not know all of what was discussed at these events. The Research Center was also closely connected to the community of Eatonville, and Andre Smith was sometimes a critic of the racial and social structure in Central Florida. Bethany Gray tells us about Smith's advocacy concerning race relations in Central Florida.
He found the community at Eatonville just to be an inspiring and lively, colorful community. He actually wrote several articles about contrast between the two communities on either side of the tracks, as you would put it, in the Winter Park Topics. Some of them are somewhat scathing. He has not the nicest things to say about some of the more traditional artists and their subject matter, and a lot of really nice things to say about the people in Eatonville that he was painting. But there were African American friends of Mr. Smith that were here regularly at the colony. He was close friends with Zora Neale Hurston, for example, and she was frequently found here having tea. And he spent a lot of time in Eatonville as well. He was familiar with many of the people over there. He enjoyed painting them. And he would have, the Eatonville Choir over for his events, which caused him a lot of trouble with the upper-class white folks that would come around here. They would tend to get into arguments about why he would have them here at the grounds, and he would tend to send the unhappy white folks home at those moments.
The connections to the Eatonville community were both artistic and social. Smith's art and advocacy did not stop at the border between Maitland and Eatonville. Zora Neale Hurston, who was not only a literary fixture of the Harlem Renaissance, but also a resident of Eatonville, was a frequent visitor at the center, and she and Andre Smith worked together on projects and plans. Bethany Gray tells us about some of these collaborations.
Probably the most interesting thing that Andre and Zora worked on together was, much like the community that Andre created here, he drew, according to the discussions that he and Zora had, plans for a cultural community very similar for her. Now, obviously it was never built, but that was sort of a little pet project that they worked on together.
Andre Smith left a legacy during his stays in Central Florida. Richard Colvin speaks to that legacy.
The number one lasting impact of Smith, I think, would have to be considered the physical stuff that he left behind, which would be the body, as it were, the corpus of the research studio, now the Maitland Art Center. It may be his greatest work of art because it's just covered with his sculpture, and the whole thing was his design. Also his own artwork and the artwork of the people that lived and worked there that is still there.
Bethany Gray tells the story of the center after the death of Andre Smith in 1959.
The colony does just sort of fall into neglect for quite some time. There were a few artists that were locals that were associated with the research studio that stayed on in some sort of buildings on the perimeter as long as they could and attempted to prevent vandalism and theft. And that went on until probably the 70s. For a while, it sat completely empty. There was a lot of damage done to the outdoor sculpture. There were pieces stolen, and the city eventually purchased it. And the agreement is that it will always be used for artistic purposes. We have a small sampling of works from each of the Bach Fellows and a pretty good collection of Andre Smith's work, which is the bulk of it belongs to the city of Maitland.
Unfortunately, We may never know the details of the inspiring discussions, heated debates, or the dialogue about race that was happening at the colony that was missing in the public conversations taking place in the streets of the local community. Instead, we have the bell and the Maitland Art Center that is the product and legacy of those discussions. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of A History of Central Florida podcast. For more information on Andre Smith, the Colony of Artists, and to see the bell featured in this episode, visit the Maitland Art Center at 231 West Packwood Avenue, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Make sure to join us for our next episode entitled Uniform.